Hello, I'm Gigi Javier Alfonso, and I'm in the process of doing a documentary on gender and multimedia in the Philippines. As I was doing research on multimedia text on gender on the web, I have noticed the lack of materials on gender and multimedia in the Philippine experience. I requested the participation of persons who are doing studies on women, gender, and multimedia in the Philippine setting to be part of this discourse. There are many valuable conversations that I have recorded. They have agreed that this will be shared with others. These are materials that will eventually be incorporated in the ongoing documentary that I'm producing. The questions that I asked were edited out to have uninterrupted discourse from each resource person. This video is a conversation with Dr. Sylvia Estrada-Claudio, who is the current director of the UP Center for Women's Studies and is an associate professor at the Department of Women Development Studies, UP Diliman, College of Social Work and Community Development. The interview was conducted on May 18, 2009 at her office at the UP Center for Women's Studies, Quezon City, Philippines.
Well, when we say gender is a social construct, which is what I would agree with, it demands certain explaining, because some people will say, are you completely disregarding the fact that men and women have bodies, that those bodies are differently made? And that's not my conception. I'm sure there's a biology that we do have bodies, and it's very important, in fact, for my theorizing and advocacies, to understand the embodied nature of people, of politics, of women and men. But I don't think we approach anything physical, biological, chemical, natural, except through the social. So what is there is a given, whether we see it or not, but how we grasp it is structured, put together by things that we also bring in as social creatures. So that's how I would approach gender as a social construct. Very interestingly, I was thinking just recently how many psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists actually then move very quickly into politics and political theory. So, you know, Foucault was a psychoanalyst. Freud also has very big political repercussions and became a political football, and a lot of feminists disliked him for very, very long. I think the classic Freud and the Freud that he meant to be really can be rejected because of his extremely sexist ideas and bent. On the other hand, I think the reason why he continues to be relevant and why a lot of people who are political go into psychoanalysis as a field of study is because we want to understand how social structure becomes deeply embedded in the individual belief systems, psychology, identity. And in terms of that, Freud can't die because he's one of the theories that has attempted to explain this. And it's only a debate whether the people who think they are influenced by Freud are still really Freudian, or we've moved on to an entirely different set of parameters. But that's how I look at Freud. The classic Freud that has structured or determined psychological practice, and then and up to now in some cases, should be rejected, I think. And one of the things we have to continue to do is to criticize psychological practice and theory if it's uncritical of Freud and it's just perpetrating gender stereotypes and oppressive views of women. But there are some parts of Freud at the more theoretical level, at the reformulated level, that might prove theoretically to be useful, or some say have proven to be useful. In terms of the leap from strictly Freudian, if we're coming from there, to post-colonial or postmodern discourse, there are clear links, and some people are saying that that Freud just didn't have the benefit of the later developments in postmodern thinking and philosophy, but he is still one of those who can be seen within the ideological line of moving towards postmodernism. So in that sense, again, it's very useful because the idea, in fact, that everything is social, there's no given unchangeable and immutable human nature, is at the beginning of postmodern theory, that there's not a intrinsic personhood. We are neither enlightened or rational. We are creations of the social milieu which we are living in. That's a very postmodern beginning point. My interest as well, because you're talking about new media, is how I think in the area of globalization, one of the most important aspects of neoliberal globalization or late stage capitalism, I don't want to know, the labels are not important, but one of the most important aspects is what we call, what I think is, aside from the opening of free markets, the free flow of goods and capital, the tremendous use of technology. I think one of the most important things about globalization is what I call biopolitical control, established through many means. Of course, there's the outright, we will create a war of terror upon you if you don't obey our imperialist prescriptions. There's also the very obvious police action every time the world powers meet, whether it's World Trade Organization, whether it's the ADB. You can see the increasing isolation of world leaders who must be put in very secure places every time any of these big meetings are held. But there's also, that is at the level of the public and the structural, but at the level of the very intimate, we're also seeing control in terms of the logic of accumulation of profits, extraction of profits, and consumerism. So very clearly, what do we say? If you're working in a call center, you understand this, because a call center agent, up to the last second, you're monitored. How much time did you spend taking the call? How much time did you spend putting out the call? And that's monitored, and depending on the sophistication of the software and the office you're working at, they can go down to seconds, and they can point out to you that you're not following, you're not productive. So this is one end of the control that is very intimate. But then, of course, as a feminist, we are very controlled in the way we view desire, the way we view relationships. So what are the latest media studies, for example? The worldwide, girls are suffering from tremendous amounts of loss of self-esteem because they feel their bodies are not good enough. One of the findings, for example, is that a significant number of girls, I think a third, would massively change their bodies if they had a chance. So we're seeing greater and greater amounts of control, usually through media, the images of media, the way we're handling even the internet and the e-groups, to more greatly control the way people look at themselves, and I think particularly the way people desire, because if you look at the construction of desire in commodified media, in sexualized media, in all of the things we read and see, desire is a lack, and then a possession, and then a fulfillment. So this is very much a wonderful way to construct desire. If you want people to buy things, to accumulate things, to want things. So if you're selling things, a construction of desire that says desire must be fulfilled and must be fulfilled by possession or accumulation, whether it's of a thing or a person that you're going to go off alone with and stare into their eyes forever, forgetting the world. It's about how capitalism would accumulate based on that desire. But there are, if you think about it, not all desire is like this. For example, those of us who have children, we would never wish for our desires for our children, not physically, of course, because we are against incest, but our dreams, our hopes, our wanting to be with them, are wanting to see them grow, look at the world through those eyes. Those desires should never be met. It would be a tragedy if we met such desires. All of us who have committed ourselves to, let's say, a monogamous lifestyle, understand that part of love is renouncing something else. And that you can, in fact, all of us who have flirted understand the nature of a desire that should never be fulfilled and yet should be wonderful. Flirting is not wonderful if you know that it's going to happen. That's a different mode of wanting, of desiring. So it's a myth, and perhaps a myth that we can change if desire is not just a psychological, physiological given. That we can look at desire in entirely different ways. So, for example, celibacy has always been constructed as sex negative, that people who want to be celibate think that the pleasures of the body are bad, and therefore it's good spiritually to give up those pleasures. And I have no problem if that's the way you want to explore your spirituality. But there are sex positive, celibate feminists and activists who say, because it's just me, I'm in a different point in my life. So the reason I'm going to this is another one of those big gender issues we're talking about, is the question of heterosexism, the genitality of sexuality, the idea that if you're born with a certain kind of genitals and a certain kind of genitals, definitely you have already the sexual orientation. Definitely there's a sexuality that's already dictated. These are things that we're discovering are not necessarily so. You don't necessarily have to be heterosexual. You don't even necessarily have to have a sexual orientation immediately. Some women are saying, I have none. I'm not bisexual because I desire both. I just don't have an orientation. And some people say, well, I'm really heterosexual. I was born that way and I don't. So we're seeing that, in fact, the social constructions of these kinds of desires, what kind of desires, what our bodies want, how we love, can be open. And the reason I like this is because then it's really up to us to create and recreate both ourselves and our intimate world to things that are more closely tied to what feminists want: justice, the bigger issues, peace, justice both in personal relationships and caring in working relationships. All these things are possible if you do those kinds of explorations. So the greater amounts of biopolitical control that I was talking about earlier, a lot of that has to do with the other, I think, important aspect of our new globalized world, which is that ICTs are central to the kind of infrastructure that our global economy and culture has, So what am I talking about? Let's say there's an emerging trend in Hong Kong that this particular design of bag is becoming popular with the youth, and multinational companies do have scouts looking at trends that are emerging from youth communities or whatever market community they want. In a second, this information is sent off within the day to somebody in New York who's doing a design, who understands. The design is done. The design is sent again to a factory in the Philippines export processing zone, where you have suddenly a new production of bags that will catch the trend immediately. So you see how clearly linked ICTs are to the modern world and the infrastructure that we have culturally. And that would be true of bags or TV programs or cultural products. I'm not a media practitioner, but my media practitioner friends tell me that they change the script as the ratings come in on TV programs. So you have this almost immediate feedback effect. And I see this trend as both, as I've noted, increasingly perhaps a point of control, but it can also be increasingly a point of resistance, resilience, and change. Because at the same time, the rise of freeware, where people, this is clearly a situation where people cannot be stopped from collaborating, in a cooperative, free, socialized way that is very much based on what each of us wants to happen, what each of us needs at the moment, and what each of us is willing to share, is exciting. The rise of social networking sites where there is no central hierarchical authority that will tell us what it is exactly we should be saying or doing is also an exciting situation. So clearly, if we do agree that this emerging media is both a site of great control, but also a site of great resistance, you politically have an idea that one of the big struggles we were going to have is to keep that internet, the band space free, to keep it continuously as it is now, not owned by any company, not controlled by any central authority, but owned by the people. So some political theorists are in fact saying that the new commons is the internet, and we have to learn from old struggles where the commons became privatized. We have to learn from old struggles that these new commons have to be kept free from any private ownership or interference. I think we have to bite the bullet here. It's either you're going to accept that we have to move into a socialist situation where ideas are creative. They've always been collaborative. We are an endless source of creativity. And therefore, the only thing that's stopping us from moving into a collaborative platform where we can just be happy together exchanging ideas and who cares who profits, or maybe nobody should profit anymore, is really an economic system whose logic is still profit and accumulation. That decision will be made at the individual level by individual professors. And many of us are seeing that already. We just put our works on the web. We don't care. Go ahead. Plenty more where that came from. It's like, it's a bit like we know very well that the content of what we text is created by us. We wonder why, let's say, a multinational, transnational corporation like Lever that produces Knorr is profiting from our sinigang, tamarind-based soup. You can buy it in a packet, and you wonder whether Unilever or Knorr will pay the Filipino people for our traditional knowledge in royalties. So whether we like it or not, the truth is our creativity, at the point when we want to talk to someone, text someone, do Facebook, whatever, our creativity is already a source of profit. I go back to what I'm talking about in terms of biopolitical control and the intimacy of capitalist accumulation at this stage in our modern world. So you are already giving away things for free that the big companies are profiting from. There's that schism. And you may decide as an individual, as a center, as an institution, as a university, how far you want this exploitation to continue. But I think what is interesting is that there is a greater and greater and greater disjunct between the tremendous creativity of ordinary people and the tremendous capacity of companies to profit from this creativity. But how long does this juncture continue? We will see. It's very interesting, and maybe perhaps it has happened. No, it's not a perhaps. This has been going on for centuries. People have been giving things free that they could profit from for centuries as well. So I hope that trend continues, and that's just part of resistance as well. There are many things that we have to do also at the structural public level to end massive poverty. I'm not saying giving one of my works off for free makes a massive blow against the poverty in the poor communities of the Philippines. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting about our understanding of the hegemonic nature of control is that it allows us also the pleasure of seeing many other activities as resistant. You point something out that's very interesting. Development never questioned the productive and reproductive processes that led to the things we were supposed to want, televisions, etc., or even food, food and shelter and clothing. There are many ways to produce basic needs or even not basic needs. Like as a feminist, I don't mind reveling in the body's pleasures and enjoying ourselves. That's not a problem. But we need to do something that is urgent now. We have to question the process by which we produce things. Is it environmentally friendly? Does it hurt anybody else? What are the social costs of these productions? So are we producing too much that we don't really need, etc.? So you're right about this critique of development. The other issue is then the decoupling of development as a sort of sovereign, national, macro, big community, city project. We're beginning to understand that if we're going to create productive processes that don't have high social costs and still meet people's basic and plus needs, it has to be local. It has to be suited to the material conditions of particular communities. So, as simple as garbage disposal, if you look at best practices, it covers a wide variety of how people can deal with their garbage at the community level. It's not one. You can have segregation this way, segregation that way, and the programs that work are rooted in the way people get together and solve their problems. So one of the interesting developments is that we are indeed having to go local, and it's so much a part also of what we've been talking about, how the new modern architecture of the world allows us great capacities for smaller individual interventions, and I think I will link that and we can come back to it later, a new emerging concept of democracy and radical democracy. Okay, so that's the first part. We can go more local, but we're also beginning to see what we mean by people-centered development. And here here we're going back to things that have nothing to do with modern architecture, but have everything to do with good old community organizing, where you in your embodied person go to the community, sit with women and talk to them. And what I've been learning from years of working also with NGOs is that development, empowerment, whatever it is you want to talk about, it is a long-term process of investment in women. We start laughing when our funding partners tell us we have to move towards self-sustainability and self-reliance, because our joke there is then we know our partners are leaving us. Because I'm talking about one of my main NGOs, the one I've spent most of my life in. It's called Likhaan. It's a reproductive health and rights NGO. We've been Likhaan for 30 years. We used to have another name, but the office, the work, the programs, the people, many of the people who work there, who've been there from the beginning, we've been there for 20 years. Okay, so 20 years it is. And we see ourselves, therefore, as self-sustainable. and we understand, we have come to learn that the empowerment development process is a long-term project with women. And it just makes really real sense, whether you're raising children, building a family, building a group of friends or a community. You don't say in 2 years you will be empowered, right? And you don't say that there are indicators that are good for everyone. So it's also very processual. So we're very polite, and truly some of the things that the funding agencies will teach you are important to help you generate a fund base, etc. But I think questions of sustainability are better asked of those who can't stay long enough to see the empowerment process come to good measure. And I'm really hoping that we can look at indicators, processes, and viewpoints where we understand that long-term investment in people is the more important parameter that we have to use as a measure. The problem with much of the discourse that goes around women empowerment, etc., is that you're only given the choice between painting yourself as a victim or painting yourself as an agent, when actually we know that even in the most repressive situations you have agency, and even in the most liberated situations you're a subject of structure. So particularly now to the report, if you look at the indicators, some of it is a fluke. They will say, for example, literacy is one of the female literacy is one indicator. Well, traditionally, Philippines it has a high literacy rate. Even if we were the basket case of Asia, even when we were the poor, even when we were in the dictatorship, we had a very high literacy rate. It is also true, however, that Filipina women, especially the more upper class ones, do enjoy a certain level of equality and freedom that maybe other similarly upper class women in other cultures may not have. So I'm proud of our Philippine women's movement. I'm proud of the fact that we can claim that it is still one of the stronger feminist movements in the world. It has a great reputation. Even when other feminist movements in other countries were experiencing an ebb, the Filipina women's movement sort of ebbed, but not as badly. And there's a strong, exciting civil society component that has many gender advocates in it in the Philippines. So this is one of the reasons, and the strength of Filipina women can come from very mainstream government institutions all the way to grassroots women who are working every day to end criminal control of access to water and electricity. We have these wonderful stories. But the big but is, if you put in other indicators, we're probably one of the worst countries in the world for gender empowerment. And what am I speaking of? We're the only country in the world other than Malta that doesn't have divorce. And Malta is like I don't know if it's exactly a typical country, because it's very, very much Catholic, almost like an extension of the Vatican in some respects. We're the only a diminishing number of countries where abortion is prohibited under all circumstances. So in that category, we join extremely enlightened nations like those ruled by the Taliban. So this is not a good thing for Filipina women. We're a diminishing number of countries where we have no laws protecting the rights of sexual minorities. There are no clear-cut legal protections for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex peoples. And also, we are now having a struggle to just give a legal basis to reproductive health services, so they cannot just be arbitrarily taken away, by any official who doesn't like contraceptives. And this has happened repeatedly over the past decade, where a government official, even the former mayor of Manila, can just decide that he will violate the Philippine Constitution and all the covenants that the Philippine government has signed on access to reproductive health and contraceptives, and refuse contraceptives in his country, in his city. So and whenever these four measures come up, you see a massive campaign by a strong church dictating on a weak state and violating the religious rights of other sectors of Philippine society, especially Filipino women. My focus in terms of what I'm really interested in is really sexuality, but from a developmental perspective. But also because, aside from being a psychologist, I'm a doctor of medicine, and I began my advocacy really as an ordinary general practitioner in poor communities, trying to understand simple health problems that should be solved easily, and they don't get solved. So a lot of feminist studies has been done, and it's clearer, especially because of our orientation in the university, which has been the political economy, and our roots in the anti-dictatorship and anti-imperialist struggles. A lot of work has been done on the other track of looking at women's oppression or people's oppression in general, which is, as I said, the economy, the productive economy. My interest really has been the reproductive economy and sexuality. So that's where I would, when talking about my studies, it's that approach that I am more interested in, and it has led to many things. The issue about the church is just one of those that gets tied up with the interest in sexuality, because the church has a very different view of women, has a very different view of sexuality from views that I think will help empower women, liberate women and their families, and even liberate men from sexual views that only lead to people's oppression. The church continues to be very negative about the body, continues to think that the body, that pleasures need to be very, very much controlled and constricted to clear confines of heterosexual, nuclear, married, and reproductive, and I will add genital, because they really would want you to have children as long as it's in marriage. If anything that falls out of that is unacceptable to the church. And as I have been saying in many of my work, that kind of construction of sexuality will make patriarchs and capitalists very happy. So, for example, the nuclear family is a classic situation where a point of extraction of profit, because in my house now, if you come to my house, and I'm not exactly part of Manila's top 400, you will see enough equipment, televisions, microwaves, refrigerator, the ordinary stuff that middle class people have, to run a commune. But each of us has that in our house, much to the delight of the capitalists who are selling us these things. If my microwave oven gets busted, I cannot call around and say, who has a similar microwave oven so that I can just cannibalize yours and repair mine and keep this running, and will save both my money and the environment, etc. That's not going to work. The fact that my house is smaller than the one in the back, but bigger than the one to my left, is not an issue. I'm allowed to accumulate tremendous amounts of wealth to the disbenefit of the poor community that's living at the end of our street. Because this is my family, I have a right to give everything. It really creates a an ideological and physical infrastructure that accepts inequity. And that would be okay if we're just adults and we learn to live, she has more, she has less. But why are there starving children down our street? Because they're somebody else's nuclear family, not mine. So it's very, very much this idea of traditional family values that the church keeps putting forwards, anchored on this kind of sexuality, is, I would say to the church, even at cross purposes to some of the things it's talking about. And you need to analyze very deeply at this level before you can understand. And that is why the church has to confront its own demons at this point. The idea, for example, that life begins at fertilization, which is currently, I think, the church position. They say it's conception, but conception is not a scientific term. So maybe if I am reading some of the other sentences correctly around this whole issue, they mean fertilization. But fertilization is something we cannot see. There's no way we can know it for that moment. We are also aware that fertilized ova are more likely not to proceed to pregnancy. That fertilized ova can often be found in menstrual blood. That 40 to 60% of fertilized ova just do not implant. And those that implant, you take another half of them don't continue to pregnancy. So we don't understand why the emphasis on this moment. There are other things we need to know. Fertilization is not a moment. From ejaculation to when the sperm cells reach the egg cells, you take a couple of hours, 6 maybe. From the time the sperm cells get to the egg cell, it takes a little time before one sperm cell usually succeeds in penetrating the ova. Before the sperm cell is able to traverse from the outer end of the egg cell to the nucleus of the egg cell, takes a little moment. Before the sperm cell is able to enter the nuclear membrane into the nucleus of the ova, takes a little more time. Before the DNA of the sperm cell and the egg cell merge, takes a little more time. Before they begin to work together as one DNA unit, takes weeks, not days. So it's not a moment. There's nothing in nature or science that makes it extremely important. Under what definition of potential of life does a fertilized ova have a potential when the large majority of fertilized ova will not become implanted in a pregnancy? The reason why the church likes this procedure is this is the moment where if you define life begins at this point, you control women's bodies, not men's. Because if I were to take the position that life begins with the sperm cell, the priests would be very angry at me. But I'm more likely to see sperm generation than I am to see fertilization. The only practical reason why you should want life to begin there is that it liberates men and gives them bodily freedom, but not women. So these are the interesting ideas about both talking about biology and social construction. Obviously, fertilization begins, but the social construction of fertilization as an important moment is subject to politics, and I would say politics that the church should be ashamed of. That's the one. So, but there are other spin-offs, as I'm saying. If you look at sexuality from the point of view of what would be good for women, for society, there are so many other issues. Adolescents don't have the information they need to be able to enjoy their bodies safely, to be responsible human beings. And I'm not talking about just giving birth. I'm talking about the crazy and bankrupt ideas about love that we keep shoving into the heads of people, and 10 years after, they're sitting in my clinic extremely unhappy about their marriages because they got married for all the most stupid reasons, especially women, because we keep telling women stupid things about self-esteem, love, and romance that has nothing to do with really learning how to love people and nurturing yourself and another human being in ways that will make you grow together. So this is another area of development and sexuality that is important. We don't have that. So my work has been about issues of the church. It has been issues about adolescent sexuality. It is issues about health programs and how we give reproductive health to people. So that has been my real interest, and still the advocacy, both academically and in developmental work. We're not paying enough attention to theorizing how sexuality is part of the systems we have, very much underlies systems we have to change, both at the social and the intimate level, if we're going to see genuine human development. Well, what's interesting, I had a very small article, which small because it was published not in what some people call a reputable academic journal, but I'm very proud of it because we published it as an NGO. Proud of it in two ways. I think it was a great article, the way it was produced, but also because we need also, going back to your question of common platforms and freedom and what is academic. One of our problems, in fact, as a third world academe, is that we should not always obey what is acceptable academic literature from the first world academe. A lot of our papers are in community journals with NGOs, written so that you produce a module on sexuality and globalization for a community that breaks it down but doesn't dumb it down. And this is truly important scholarly work. As a person who can also publish in accepted academic journals, but as a person whose early training was how do you teach tuberculosis to an illiterate peasant so that this peasant understands how to be a health worker in their community. Both works are extremely requiring of scholarship and understanding, and equally important to helping people and making the academe accountable to society. So it's not an either or. I love respectable academic journals with 75 well-known references. I love that part. That also excites me when I see these things. But why is it that this other knowledge is so disadvantaged? Going back to that article, I realized after a while, about 5 or 6 years ago, that our advocacy for sexual rights, including the right to sexual fantasies, and the advocacy against consumerist depictions and patriarchal and violent depictions in pornography and media were going to clash at some point, at least in the Philippine movement. It hadn't happened yet, at least not in that part of the Philippine women's movement where I live. But I knew that there might be a point where it would clash, because many of my dearest, deepest friends have been working very hard criticizing pornography, and much of it should be criticized indeed. But some of us were already working in sexual reproductive health and rights, and you have a right to your fantasies. Whatever they are, you have a right to your happy, rich, sexual fantasy life. I would make the distinction between fantasizing rape and keeping it to yourself, or someone else who wants to fantasize with you, and actually doing the thing. Those are two diametrically different situations. So what I did, and I'm happy it came together, was call my friends and some of the well-known feminists working on the anti-pornography side, and some of the feminists working on the sexual rights side, and we talked. We just put our cards on the table, and I said, look, this is a problem, let's talk about it. And we talked for 3 consecutive evenings till 2 in the morning, with lots of wine, you can imagine, and came up with a monograph, which we published in one of my NGOs. So it's very interesting what we said, for example, about pornography. First of all, we did say that we could not, as feminists, say that we could come to complete agreement about every single sexual portrayal. Not just that whether this is patriarchal, pornographic, unacceptable, but even whether it was boring, exciting, or erotic. Even if we trusted each other completely with what our values, feelings, tastes are, we were sure that there would be many times where someone would say, that is really yucky. And someone would say, it's just boring. Or, it's fun. Or, I like it. Okay, so that was the first. Having said that, we were also very sure that we were against censorship, especially of women's issues and sexual portrayals, given that we have a government body who is captured by the Catholic Church and censors who have absolutely no taste in erotica, who have no idea about what is aesthetic, because as far as our censors is concerned, anything slightly sexual is not aesthetic. So we didn't want to give power to a bunch of people who we think are, they say they're hewing to community standards, but we don't know what community they're talking about. Perhaps the community that's in their office. But definitely, we had no acceptance of that censorship. Just as an aside, if you work with women in the communities, they're not afraid of sex. They're not. It's a patronizing, upper class, elitist thing to say that these things are not important to poor women, that they're afraid to talk about it, that they find this bastos. It depends. You know, they're finding it obscene. It depends. It depends on where you're with, if they trust you, how you're approaching them, but it's extremely important to women, and they're not ashamed to talk about sexual matters once you're working with them in a proper context. And the fact that we don't ask is just, I think, patronizing of the censors in even political parties of the left. Okay, so we didn't want censorship to happen in this context. So there are several things also. We think that intellectual products should be differentiated from the production process. Sometimes, if it's a cup of coffee, it's not an intellectual process. We can call for a boycott of the coffee of that particular coffee chain if they're planting rainforests in Brazil in order to fulfill their coffee bean need, because it's not an intellectual product. But we made the distinction between an intellectual product, which we think should not be censored, should be allowed to go down, but the extreme control of the production process. So if you're going to produce sexual depictions of anything, please don't kill the person at the end of the snuff film, really, and we know this happens. Do not exploit children, etc., etc. Okay, so we made that second point. And the third point, one of the points we also made about pornography in that monograph of ours is that we might be wasting our time talking about censorship, sexual depiction, what to do with it, when the real issue at hand is helping people have a different set of standards in terms of sexuality, what viewing sexuality means, what are the standards by which we judge things that make us happy, desirous, erotic. And maybe it's that is the bigger issue for feminists, not the portrayal, but what are the sexual ethics behind the things we do? What are the reasons our tastes are cultured and developed this way? And so we thought, while we don't want censorship, we also will never ever condemn anyone who comes up and says that's an awful portrayal and it should not have been shown, and these things are also acceptable. In fact, it's our duty to look at a particular sexual portrayal and say, I'm going to join a rally against a restaurant that put this kind of a poster on their wall. So these are that was, for example, one of the things we did, and I think that's also very important. We also took into consideration that when there were experiments, I believe in the US, on community censorship that really looked at standards, a lot of lesbian film and art got censored out, even on the basis of community standards. So we thought, never mind the censorship part. There is a question whether gender studies is women's studies, or how they influenced each other, if somebody gave birth to something. Coming from the perspective, at least, of what I know is the earlier movement, which is women's studies, there are several kinds of feminist theories, some of which would never have given birth to gender studies. Because my understanding of gender, as I said as we started it, is understanding first that it's a social construction. So some feminist theories that did accept that sex is a given, and it's gender that can be changed, I don't think we're very productive in understanding that sex is not a given, and both biology and society are tied up in the concept of gender. Those feminist theories that did indeed grasp this, those feminist theories that never just viewed oppression as the oppression of women by men, but understood that there are multiple sites of oppression and control, race, class, disability, ethnicity, many other things. Given a particular moment, there will always be power situations that people find themselves in. Those have been very useful in giving birth to a broad range of other theoretical positionings, including gender studies. That has contributed very much to it, including post-colonial studies as well. So the question of who gave birth to whom, if you talk about collaborative networks of people working completely on their own and then coming out to find that somebody else working completely on their own was doing something very similar, or people who have always said, you know, I got that idea from someone else who got, and I know she got it from someone else, and actually we talked. This whole beehive, a network of creative thinking and theory. I don't know who gave birth to who, but definitely you can see interconnections theoretically and practically in a lot of gender and women's studies work. It's important to do two things. First, to understand that there are very distinct academic theoretical disciplines. There's a basis for that. Very distinct struggles and resistances, both in terms of gender, LGBTI struggles, and feminist struggles, that one should not think in a binary way when viewing both the theories and the struggles. But the other side of the coin also, that while they are distinct, there is really, in my mind, a strategic reason that they should be together. And then I will return to why sexuality, the concept of sexuality, desire, reproductive work, and the reproductive economy is important to me, because that's where they will come together, and that's the big arena of struggle where all these particular movements must join together if we're going to overhaul the way we desire. The question of gender mainstreaming, for example, is very controversial for the women's movement. In general, I think, and especially in the Philippines, and we're quite known for being great gender mainstreamers and using governments and the bureaucracy to work things out. I will answer it in two ways, what I think, and also how we will handle the differences. And they're both extremely important content issues. The first one is, I accept the critiques. We live here. We live here. We know that there are good practices and a whole lot of bad practices. When there are good practices, it's wonderful and we all feel really good. When there are bad practices, we know that ballroom dancing enters into the gender budget and is considered a women's activity. So we also know that as long as you don't question the mainstream, then we'll become equal in a really bad mainstream. So this is not a nice thing to happen. And we also know that that part of the world that gender mainstreaming reaches does not reach other aspects of women's lives and realities. I frankly think that no amount of gender mainstreaming in government, in institutions, etc., will change the sexual division of labor, which is at the basis of a lot of our problems as individuals and as a society. I think the push that will end that will come from somewhere else, not from the efforts at gender mainstreaming. Having said that, the question arises, and this is, I think, important for those of us who are activists when we're talking about organization. How do we, as a movement, or movements of the left, or broadly cut, how does the transformative movement view differences? And I think one also of the insights of postmodern politics is the understanding that differences are not a political problem. Even if the content is entirely, even if in words we're saying exactly opposite things, perhaps it's not going to be a political liability. In fact, the call of unity has been used over and over and over again against activists, organizations, and transformative movements to put us down and to make us squabble against each other. If we understand a new view of power, that the power is hegemonic, that it works at both structural levels and the very intimate levels, that that there are power dynamics that are good across time and power dynamics that occur only at the moment when we're sitting at the table against the World Bank official whom we want to kick in wherever. If we understand these things, then we also then begin to see that we can have a new ethics of politics that takes strength from from the differences. And let me then move from the very theoretical to the concrete. The concrete is the last time I was in Congress, lower house, the bigger house. Because of the reproductive health bill that we're trying to get passed, and we had another really frustrating day because of the obfuscation, shenanigans, obstructionism of the allies of the church in the House. We went out of the session hall after the session ended, essentially having spent the day there accomplishing very little. And the groups I was with started chanting. Just to let the steam off and a way of saying goodbye, the usual. And the chanting was such that you could dance to it. So who would come out to dance to it? Two groups that don't give birth. Very elderly women who had come with us in their complete Filipiniana costumes, looking very conservative and traditional, started dancing with what we would call our typical gay parlor personnel, right? What we call in Filipino parloristas, and they started dancing. And the way they were dancing was that the elderly ones were dancing in sort of a coracha style, and the parloristas were in complete DI mode, And it was amazing to me. I said, if you want to know what queer politics is about, coalitions of people coming together for a particular issue. And we never move, my organization never moves without explaining. We don't bus people to Congress who don't know what's going on. They're there because they know what they're fighting for and they come on their own free will. So you see people fighting for an issue. Perhaps it's not their main issue. Perhaps it is. Perhaps they're learning something from it. But you also see this great politics. And so you can see people can come together for a particular issue, for moments of unity, even if they may have very broad differences later. The other thing is when the Catholic Church was calling for a big prayer rally during the time of our EDSA II revolution against President Estrada, who was unseated because of charges of massive corruption. And the church was putting on its seemingly progressive face by calling for a big rally against this corruption. There were, in a meeting of huge political parties and groups, there were two organizations that said, we're not going. Anything that the church calls, we're not going, because we want to hold the church accountable for its extremely reactionary position. Not just on women, but as I'm explaining, if you're reactionary against the reproductive economy, you're also reactionary against class struggles. So, if you're reactionary in the area of sexuality, then you are stroking capitalism with one hand while pretending to slap it with the other. That's what we feel, and that's what we said. That was Likhaan, which I think is a medium-sized NGO at best. And the lesbian advocates of the Philippines, who at that time I think were an office of 2 and a membership of 15. But that was very interesting because we were sitting with huge groups who suddenly thought, And I understand that a lot of people heard of the issue for the first time. A lot of people began to understand, it's not as simple as it seems to be. And a lot of feminist groups said, we absolutely respect the position of these women. You should listen to them, but we're going. And when they went, we said, we absolutely respect the position of these women because we understand they are going for these reasons and not those reasons. And I think that kind of a handling of politics where, to speak in postmodern terms, you don't reify identities to the point that they cause divisions, extremely important. And so when we talk of postmodernism and when we talk about what feminist theories and struggles also bring to the table in terms of tools of political analysis and strategic thinking, and then deciding programs and actual actions, I think we're going to have to talk about the new kind of ethics that these new tools of analysis are giving us. If we have a new view of power, if we have a new view of resistance, if we have a new view of the architecture of the world, which is still capitalist and patriarchal and racist, but it's a different architecture, then we also need to talk about a new kind of political ethics. The University of the Philippine Center for Women's Studies was established 20 years ago. And it's an office that has a system-wide function. In other words, it has a function that works with the campus, all the campuses of the University of the Philippines nationwide. And the objectives of the center are to create and sharpen awareness of women and gender issues in the university, as well as society at large, to encourage and strengthen teaching, research, extension, and advocacy programs on and for women, to strengthen and vitalize multi- and interdisciplinary programs in women's studies, to initiate the integration of gender concepts in the academic curricula, to promote incentives for the recognition of women's achievements and contribution to national development and gender consciousness, and to provide an organizational umbrella within UP for university-wide activities in women and gender studies. So we are very proud of our center, of course, because we are given the power to do several things, to go deeply into gender and women's studies, to make sure that they stay within the university's theoretical domain and field of activity and work, but also because we are allowed to do something that the University of the Philippines is also very proud of, which is to be accountable to the Filipino people by advocating from within the university to society, and by taking what women in society want and bringing into the academe so that it informs our scholarship as well.
I would like to acknowledge the help of the Multimedia Center of the University of the Philippines Open University in recording and editing this production. If you have questions and inquiries on the material that you have just viewed, please email me at gigipsssp@yahoo.com.